Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date and help the channel grow. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And now, on with the show. You are listening to the Narrated, Not the Popular Opinion with the one and only Gray. Greetings, opinion nerds. It is I, the one they call Gray, and today we're going to take a double shot of murder mystery with Rian Johnson's Glass Onion and Scott Cooper's The Pale Blue Eye on this random act of opinion coming up right now. When you're faced with a choice, why not just choose both, opinion nerds? Netflix is an interesting distributor. Most entities that release films try to ensure they aren't cannibalizing the audience for a certain kind of release by putting out more than one even vaguely similar film in the same window. But since streamers like Netflix don't have to worry about theater bookings and marketing, they can just let anything fly at any time. So if they wanted to say, release two murder mystery films within a week of each other, they could do that and incur no significantly negative outcome. So it has come to pass that Netflix has released writer-director Rian Johnson's Glass Onion, the sequel to the director's acclaimed 2019 murder mystery comedy Knives Out, starring Daniel Craig, and writer-director Scott Cooper's The Pale Blue Eye, starring Christian Bale, and two more radically different films you could not possibly ask for, giving one an idea of how far the contrast in a single genre of storytelling can be pushed. The only mystery here is whether one should watch one, the other, or both. In Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery, tech mogul Miles Braun plans a murder mystery getaway for his close group of friends when the world's greatest detective receives an invitation by mistake. Or did he? When one of the guests is actually killed, we find that things are both not as they appear to be and exactly what they look like. Written and directed by Rian Johnson, the film stars Daniel Craig, Edward Norton, Kate Hudson, Kathryn Hahn, Leslie Odom Jr., Janelle Monáe, Jessica Henwick, and Dave Bautista. 2019's Knives Out was a surprisingly sharp, witty mystery that rode hard on the shoulders of its insanely talented cast. Writer-director Rian Johnson is no stranger to putting unique twists on murder mysteries, having kicked off his career with Brick, a noir murder mystery set in a Midwestern high school and featuring a cast of archetypal characters translated down to school-aged teens. If there was a gag in Johnson's approach, it's that the film was played entirely straight, creating a mature, darkly engaging mystery. After a couple of dips into science fiction, one rather well received, the other not quite so much, Johnson came back to the murder mystery with a humorous tale about a selfish family squabbling over an inheritance anchored by a charismatic performance from Daniel Craig as the newest entry into the pantheon of cinematic gumshoes, Benoit Blanc. Johnson was able to both craft a fun mystery and forge a cast of eccentric characters that kept audiences engaged, but the real star was Craig's Blanc, a highly intelligent Southern gentleman type that served as a counterpoint to the rude and likably unlikable Northeastern family whose parasitic greed raised a killer among them. Having been well received by audiences to the tune of $312 million on a budget of only $40 million, Netflix spent somewhere in the area of $450 million buying up the rights to two sequels. Glass Onion is the first in this deal, and while it too has been successful among critics and could have been a financial boon for the streaming service had they allowed it to stay in theaters longer than a special run, the second installment in the adventures of Detective Blanc hasn't quite been as well received by general audiences as the first. Like the metaphor of the title, it isn't difficult to see where audiences have split on the film. The film is built around the metaphor of the glass onion, a thing that looks layered and complex but is, in fact, completely transparent. While the movie rides the metaphor very hard, it's not an unclever approach, as Johnson's twist involves putting some very obvious information right in front of the audience and then taking them on a long ride, throwing on layer after layer of confusion in an attempt to trick the audience into believing things are more complex than they really are. As mysteries, both films in the Knives Out series rely more on plot twists than building tension because they are both more humorous satire than thriller. While Knives Out took shots at the pettiness and greed of legacy wealth, Glass Onion is more interested in lampooning the culture of tech billionaires who act as if they want to change the world but are really just taking advantage of the goodwill of others to line their pockets. Johnson uses the film to make the statement that people are rarely who they appear to be, from the genius innovator to the social media influencer, and even including the world's greatest detective who, as it turns out, is mostly incapable of carrying out the mundane tasks of his trade. There is no doubt Johnson is a smart writer and a clever storyteller, and Glass Onion is an example of how easy it can be to manipulate an audience. However, not everyone has been so pleased with that, as they don't see the manipulation as clever so much as frustrating. As much praise as Glass Onion has received, there is a contingent of the audience that hasn't embraced it as warmly, and the issue appears to be one of believability. Many feel that the film requires the audience to accept some pretty substantive leaps and lapses in intelligence for it all to work, and this is because the film kind of leans into a certain cartoonishness that its predecessor did not. The plot is written tightly, there are no holes, and it doesn't unravel, so the mystery is intact. But getting into it requires the audience to accept a number of things in hindsight that can break the immersion in the film if your perspective is based on the assumption that any of it is to be taken seriously. This shouldn't need to be reiterated, but this is a movie, not real life. The things that happen are the only things that can happen because someone wrote it to be so. So saying if X person hadn't been in the right place at the right time, then Y thing couldn't have happened is a patently stupid statement. That being said, usually the idea of a movie is to try and create the illusion that X person being in Y place at the right time was an organic event, and the issue some are having with the film is that many of the most important events that allow the film to happen don't feel organic. At some point in many films, you're going to have to accept a bit of contrivance, and a couple of instances every here and there can be overlooked. But enough of them pile up and it starts to tear at the illusion of the film to the point that the immersion is damaged, and this is the fate that befalls Glass Onion. There are too many things, like a character's lawyers not explaining to them exactly what a sweatshop is before they sign a potentially dangerous contract, or a character being saved from a gunshot in the most unbelievably cliche manner possible, or the film's villain inviting the one person everyone there knows can blow a nuclear-sized crater in the center of their lives to his private beach island party, and not one person confronting that individual about the issue at any point, because that aspect of the plot isn't revealed until a later point in the film. Added together, these kinds of things make the entire affair a bit too unbelievable. And when it comes to a film like this, believability is really the only currency you have to spend. The clever screenplay uses the first half of the film as a big misdirect, while the second half fast forwards through the plot a second time before the finale. Because of this, the key emotional drive of the film needs to be essentially reset, and you end up following a completely different character for a completely different reason. The idea is that the new story is meant to build on the previous one and increase the overall dramatic weight of the proceedings. But the film's hurried retelling of the plot, combined with its mid-film reveal and overall irreverent tone, means the emotional weight of the combined story doesn't land with the intended force. With the mystery all but rendered inert and the story lacking in impact, what the film ends up leaving the audience with most is the combined weight of its various commentaries that ends with the heroine destroying a priceless work of art, apparently because it would make the villain sad? Johnson may be a clever writer, but cleverness is both a blessing and a curse. And while Glass Onion can be a very entertaining movie, as a murder mystery it feels like it's cheating, while at the same time telling you that the thing you tuned in for, the mystery, doesn't really matter. It's an act of subversion that, while indeed clever, may not appear to provide any value to the thing it's subverting. It's a question of whether the subversion has a purpose, whether it says something about its subject, or if it's subversion just for the sake of being clever, subversion for subversion's sake. If anything, it can be assessed that the real purpose of the movie was to serve as a vehicle for Johnson's social commentary, which is within his purview as an artist. You'll have to decide how you feel about that. Now, if Glass Onion's attempt to put a twist on the murder mystery genre doesn't suit your fancy, you have a second option in writer-director Scott Cooper's The Pale Blue Eye, a much more classic take on the murder mystery formula that isn't without a few surprises of its own. In 1830, a former police constable is recruited to investigate a suicide at West Point Military Academy, a case which escalates to a series of seemingly occult murders. Engaging the services of a student at the academy, Augustus Landor and the young Edgar A. Poe attempt to determine the nature of the crime and catch a killer, all while Landor wrestles with a secret pain. Written and directed by Scott Cooper based on the novel by Louis Baynard, the film stars Christian Bale, Harry Melling, Gillian Anderson, Lucy Boynton, Simon McBurney, Timothy Spall, Toby Jones, and Robert Duvall. The Pale Blue Eye is the third collaboration between Cooper and Bale after 2017's Hostiles and 2013's Out of the Furnace. Cooper's approach to adapting the novel is a more or less straight-up-the-middle whodunit, matching Bale's older, weary detective with Melling's passionate young version of famous poet Edgar Allan Poe. The dead of winter setting in upstate New York provides the requisite gloomy backdrop befitting the character of Poe, employed here much the same way the author would be in 2012's John Cusack starring The Raven, and conjuring up the specter of television series that match by-the-book police detectives with unconventional non-police partners to play with the juxtaposition of the two. Both a point of strength and weakness, Landor and Poe are not so different, so there's far less friction and butting of heads than might be found on one of those TV shows. However, the point is not to contrast the characters against each other as much as to show how they complement one another, building a solid mentor-mentee friendship based on respect far from the grudging variety. Like many films of the type, the murder mystery itself is just the bait, not the hook. And while the inclusion of Poe as a character is more or less a gimmick, the real mystery is Bale's Landor, the atheistic loner still grieving over the death of his wife and the loss of his daughter, who he says ran off with a man and disappeared. Everything about The Pale Blue Eye is competently produced, from the period recreations to the naturalistic cinematography. Bale's performance as Landor has spark enough to make the character interesting, but is restrained enough to allow Melling's Poe to stand out. That the two aren't competing for the audience's attention is a testament to Cooper's even-handed treatment of the material. At the same time, Cooper is not an intensely visual director, so there is an overall flat and sparse look to the film accompanied by an often unengaged camera. The film is, after all, a character drama and not a spectacle or a thriller that seems intent on emphasizing the naturalistic reality of the material. But the slow, even build to the finale can be seen as lacking punch. The rather late in the proceedings addition of a love interest for Poe doesn't feel as if it has proper time to blossom, nor does it convey the implied sense of manipulation on the young lady's part. And with no real action to speak of, the film can be seen as lacking energy to keep the viewer engaged enough to get them to the subtle but enjoyable character work. This is one of those kinds of films where the worst thing you can really say about it is that there isn't really much to talk about. It's a solid film with a competent screenplay and strong performances, but it just doesn't do anything. There's humor, but it's very subdued. The leads work well together, but they don't spark on screen despite their best efforts. The movie isn't trying to be fun, so there is no sense of adventure. And while all of this is rather contextualized by the end, it doesn't change the fact that the storytelling to get you there can be underwhelming and unengaging for some. This is a film meant to appeal to a certain adult audience that enjoys a quieter, slower-paced film, but it doesn't necessarily offer enough intellectual challenge or artistic flair to elevate its production. It's a solid film, just not an ambitious one. It's doubtful the movie was very expensive, at least not compared to the kinds of blockbusters that grab attention. But its delivery to Netflix with very little promotion means it will likely disappear into the murky pit of their digital catalog, along with hundreds of other lower and mid-budget films that used to be the engines of Hollywood careers. See, the old logic is that actors and filmmakers would do big Hollywood films so they could afford to do the little ones that interested them more, working more for the experience of the job than the paycheck. But if no one is watching them or even knows they exist, will these kinds of movies keep getting made? And if they don't, where does the next generation of great filmmakers learn how to make the next generation of great films? It would be difficult for Glass Onion and The Pale Blue Eye to be further apart as films within the same broad genre. Glass Onion is witty and quickly paced with an aesthetic that borders on cartoonish. The film's mystery seems to be used as the gimmick or hook, while the film's emotional value is intermingled with its themes. The mystery itself is mostly inconsequential, used as a means to deliver the film's statements about the dangers of tech bro influence on culture and politics and how often people pretend to be someone they're not to get the things they want. In contrast, The Pale Blue Eye is a slow, methodical procedural whose entertainment value comes from the interaction of its two leads and whose emotional engagement is the mystery beneath the mystery. By comparison, the film is far more conventional but also far more subtle in terms of delivering its themes, while the themes themselves are more critical of institutions than a specific class of people. Glass Onion relies on its comedy to keep the audience engaged with the mystery, while The Pale Blue Eye uses the mystery to keep the audience engaged with the character drama. The films are also angling for two very different audiences. Glass Onion's vibrant colors, snarky wit, and upbeat tempo would seem to imply a desire for a more youthful engagement, while The Pale Blue Eye's restrained palette and mature tone courts an older audience. Johnson is much more the attempted provocateur than Cooper, a person interested in the idea of disrupting the status quo in ways that strike some as conscious to the point of being distractingly obvious. Cooper seems to be more of a classicist in terms of filmmaking, whose interest is in the exploration within the film and not necessarily using film as a means to make change. Johnson approaches his filmmaking in a way that constantly reaches for the audience's engagement, while Cooper operates under the assumption that the audience has already chosen to engage with the material, and so he shouldn't need to keep convincing them to do so. And while both are using film to provoke an emotional response, Cooper seems to be looking to provoke empathy for his characters, while Johnson wants to provoke outrage towards his subject. I enjoyed both films to a certain degree, but if asked to watch one again, I would without a doubt put The Pale Blue Eye on. I'm not really on board with much of Glass Onion's approach to humor, and though the film may not actually be cheating the mystery, it certainly feels like it is, and that's enough for me. But it also feels unbelievable, and that would be problem enough if it didn't just compound the issues with the mystery. And as much as I hate to agree with some of the more negative commentary from my peers, one does wonder if Johnson either believed the movie was as smart as it aspires to be, or if some people believe it's smart because it takes a couple of clever turns and says the right things. People who have a high opinion of themselves tend to believe that if they think something is smart, then it must be because the alternative is impossible for them to fathom. Now that doesn't mean that The Pale Blue Eye is the most engaging film I've watched in a while, but if nothing else, I can buy it. And as much fun as it is watching Daniel Craig turn on his "I'm just a country chicken" routine, turning up the volume on that facade makes it somehow less fun than it was the first time around because it feels more like an act. The Pale Blue Eye may be a far drier film than Glass Onion, but it's not trying to be clever. It doesn't feel like it's trying to sell something, and its sense of restraint makes it more compelling, at least to me. The Pale Blue Eye is a film I honestly believe I would have gone out to see had it been released theatrically. And as much as I enjoyed Knives Out, I'm not sure I can say I would have done the same for Glass Onion. Neither movie set my world on fire, but I will always gravitate towards the movie I feel is the most sincere. And where Glass Onion feels like it's smirking at the audience, The Pale Blue Eye feels like it's having a conversation with it. I couldn't tell you which one is the better made film, but I can tell you which one settles better with me. And while this may be because I'm part of that older demographic The Pale Blue Eye aims for, Glass Onion isn't exactly a kid's movie, so I can't support the idea that my reaction is just an issue of years. But once again, when it comes to certain kinds of movies, maybe I really am just too Danny Glover for this shit. It's a little crazy for me to step back and see that there is so much film and television content being produced and released so rapidly that at any given time you can find 2 or 3 new pieces within the same basic genre to choose from to watch, to consider, and to compare. And this isn't like a Red Planet Mission to Mars thing where you have 2 similar films each rushing to beat each other to market. This is just movies being released when they're released, and there just being so many that you're bound to find at least a couple of similar films hitting at the same time. Netflix releasing 2 murder mysteries a week apart is an absolutely no-risk endeavor for the service and an all-reward outcome for their subscribers. Glass Onion and The Pale Blue Eye are both very high-quality films that offer very different experiences for different audiences within the murder mystery space. And while I might not personally be as warm towards Glass Onion's overt attempts at being clever as I am The Pale Blue Eye's more somber tone, I would still recommend that fans of the genre check them both out. It's an embarrassment of riches just waiting to be mined with very little risk. Why someone wouldn't give both of these films a try is a mystery to me. This has been the Narrated, Not the Popular Opinion. As always, I have been Gray, and if you like what you heard, you can leave a tip at our Ko-Fi page at ko-fi.com/notthepopularopinion. You can follow us on Twitter at @only_Gray, and don't forget our main page at notthepopularopinion.wordpress.com, where you'll find more great articles just like this. Thanks again for listening, and remember, if you're as good to others as you are to yourself, we might just make it through this mess. See ya.